Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, December 9th, 2023. We begin with author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston and Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne, who will be joined on the line by Professor Sean M. Kelley from the Department of History at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom. For our purposes today, he's the author of the book American Enslavers, Merchants, Mariners, and the Transatlantic Commerce and Captives, 1644 to 1865. If you'd like to know and learn the connection between Madagascar pirates and the American slave trade, then do not touch that dial. Then in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from Elena K. Abbott, author of the book Beacons of Liberty, International Free Soil, and the Fight for Racial Justice in Antebellum America. She'll be in conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne, and this will certainly be yet another informative discussion to expand your knowledge about the dark history of this place called America. But that's not all. Make sure you mark your calendars for an opportunity to meet Dr. Gerald Horne in the flesh. Kick your Black History Month 2024 off the best way possible by joining Freedom Now and Move the Crowd for a conversation and book signing hosted by Dr. Melina Abdullah. It's going down on Saturday, February 3rd from 1 to 3 p.m. in Africatown, aka Lamert Park, at 3423 West 43rd Place. Purchase your tickets online at kpfk.org or at the door. So save the date and stay tuned for more info. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and still able to bring you this much quality content, we want to remind you to call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org and you'll be able to pledge your support to the station at any level. Remember, these are all tax-deductible donations, and you can take home one of our fantastic premiums from the library of Dr. Gerald Horne, available for your donation of $100 or more. But don't just take my word for it. Dr. Horne, please tell the people about what they can take home today.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses. I dare say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the Kelley Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by US imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 to receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical History. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. And make your pledge today to support our efforts here at Freedom Now. Of course, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Black Moon, Gil Evans, Gigi Grice, Richard Barata, Afro Jazz, and Brandy Younger. Now people, get ready for this train a coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Sean M. Kelley.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Sean M. Kelley, professor of history at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom, and author of the book American Slavers, Merchants, Mariners, and the Transatlantic Commerce and Captives, 1644 to 1865. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles, Sean M. Kelley.
Thank you very much, Gerald, and just thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote this book as the result of a couple of years ago, I published a book on that took a very close look at a single slave trading voyage that took place during the mid-18th century. And during the course of, researching that book, I realized that although there was quite a lot of slave trading going on, there were a lot of American slave traders, we really lacked a book that tied all of this together. At least nothing since W.E.B. Du Bois very famously published his dissertation at the end of the 19th century. And I knew there was a big story here. It was something that I felt strongly needed to be out there and needed to be put together. There were some works that looked at aspects of this, but I felt at the time that a lot of them were older and out of date. So it seemed to me that the time was ripe to put this together. That's what got me into the book.
Now, Madagascar, the gigantic island off the southeast coast of the African mainland, plays a role in your book. How so?
Well, this was actually one of the big surprises. Once I really got into it, I started to learn a lot of new things and find things that I hadn't expected. Madagascar was one of the destinations in Africa for American slave traders. And this was really at the very end of the 17th century, the late 1600s. And it was really associated most strongly with slave traders and merchants from New York. And so for a period of about 10 or 12 years, thereabouts, Madagascar became the focus of American slave trading. And this was not carried out on the same scale that it would be later. So comparatively, we're not talking about lots and lots of ships or lots and lots of people. But it nevertheless was the focus. And the attraction, as far as these, think of them as kind of early slave traders, the attraction was a pirate's nest that had taken shape on the northeast corner of Madagascar. And these were pirates who had been raiding. Their main business was to raid Muslim shipping in the Indian Ocean. But they also dealt in captives. And so the New Yorkers, and a lot of this was in the control of a very, very wealthy New York merchant named Frederick Phillips, targeted this particular pirate settlement in Madagascar. And as I say, for a period of years, sent ships there to purchase captives, many of whom were taken straight back to New York. Some of them were brought into the Caribbean. But it's a strange episode because it took place very early on in the history of the American slave trade. And the early slave traders, in essence, kind of didn't really know what they were doing. They couldn't build networks. But what happened here with Madagascar was sort of the beginnings of a real a connection between New York and Madagascar that lasted about a dozen years. One of the other kind of interesting things that was happening is that a lot of these slave traders, and this was actually quite unusual, actually took part in raids on the Malagasy people in Madagascar. They would pirates would sometimes raid them. Sometimes the slave traders would partner with different African polities or Malagasy polities to raid for captives, and they would keep a share of them. So this is an extremely violent and kind of ultimately pretty volatile chapter in the history of the slave trade. Ultimately, this pirate settlement was attacked by the Malagasy and destroyed, and that made it impossible for this all to continue. But it's a very intriguing chapter in the history of all of this in the very early years of the American slave trade.
Now, your reference to New York and New York City, I presume, reminds us that at least in the popular imagination, oftentimes the exclusive enterprise of enslavement is laid at the doorstep of the states of the South, such as South Carolina and Georgia, for example. But you tell a story that links North and South jointly. For example, Rhode Island is a major embarkation point for enslavers heading across the Atlantic, with, of course, many of the enslaved deposited in Charleston, South Carolina, amongst other sites. I'm wondering, are there any political implications of that? The fact that enslavement linked North and South, and not just was the sole province of the South?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Just to kind of, the vast majority of American slave ships left northern ports, and you mentioned Rhode Island. If there's any place that deserves to be called the capital of the American slave trade, it's Rhode Island. It's responsible for nearly half of the slaving voyages that were sent out of North America. And then beyond Rhode Island, New Yorkers, Bostonians, as you say, a lot of Northerners were involved in this. The South plays a slightly different role. And if you think about a place like Charleston, South Carolina, for most of its history, we, of course, would also say Charleston is a slaving port or it's a slave trading port. But it's a slave trading port that mostly receives slave ships and incoming captives, and then of course distributes those captives to the rural areas. There is one period in American history when South Carolina became a major dispatch point for slave ships, and that was this very brief and very significant period between 1804 and 1807, when South Carolina, in essence, kind of repealed a state law that had prevented slave trading. They opened it back up for just a few years before eventually the federal government closed it. And in that year, Charleston became a major dispatch point. And this actually turns out to be the statistical peak of the American slave trade. So it's a complicated question. Politically, it led to some kind of interesting things. You were asking about that. Southerners liked to, especially later on in the 19th century, Southerners liked to kind of make the point that, who the slave traders are in the United States? They're the New Englanders. It's the Yankees. Those are the people who did it. And they loved to make this point during the 19th century, during periods of sectional tension. They made the point during the Missouri Crisis debates and so forth. And for the most part, they were correct. And so this has led to a kind of, it's actually led to a lot of confusion on the part of Americans that sort of carries on today about who was it who engaged in slave trading. But I think it has the political implications were also that eventually later on in the 19th century, Southerners, especially as they were trying to reopen the slave trade in the 1850s, began to resist cracking down on the slave trade. I guess this, in summary, what I would say is, the slave trade is mostly a northern enterprise, and except for a short period, and that Southerners were able to kind of play on this hypocrisy and delighted in it in a lot of the slave trade debates.
So what part of Africa beyond Madagascar in the early 1700s, late 1600s, did U.S. enslavers prey upon heavily?
Well, there are two regions of Africa that had a long-standing, sustained relationship with the United States, as far as these slave ships are concerned. The slave ships that are leaving the United States. The first of these is what you could call what I usually refer to as Upper Guinea, and if you were thinking of a map, these would be the modern states of Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Republic of Guinea, Sierra Leone. So that part of Africa, and that was actually the part of Africa where the very first American slave traders went. I mean, one reason for that is it's relatively close to the United States compared with other parts of Africa, and that was through the 200-year history of the American slave trade. Upper Guinea was almost continuously a source, at least at one level or another, for American slavers. But the place that I think, if you were to run the numbers, the place where American slavers got most of their captives would be a different part of Africa, and that would be what's now modern-day Ghana, and was called at the time the Gold Coast. And this particular part of Africa had a very intense relationship particularly with New England and particularly with Rhode Island. So during the real peak years of the American slave trade, it's most of the 18th century and into the early 19th century, this area here, the Gold Coast, was the destination of most American slave ships. And not surprisingly, because slave ships tended to bring back, even if they didn't necessarily sell the captives, all of them back in North America, they usually took them to the Caribbean, but they would still take back a few people. And you can see in places like Newport, Rhode Island, these slave trading ports, a kind of critical mass of Africans from that particular part of Africa, from the Gold Coast area, the Akan-speaking regions of what's now Ghana.
Now, thus far, Professor Kelley, you've talked about the peak of the slave trade being in the 18th century, the early part of the 19th century. But what about the role of U.S. enslavers and slave traders in Cuba? I take it that it extends beyond that time frame. And likewise, I take it that the areas of Africa that were preyed upon may also change. For example, a larger role for what is now Nigeria, a larger role for what is now Angola. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. So Cuba became a very important market, put it that way, for American slave traders at the end of the 18th century. And this happened for a number of years. Prior to that point, most American slave ships carried captives to the British colonies. And because, of course, before 1776, North America was part of the British Empire. But after the American Revolution, the Americans were more or less shut out. So they began looking for other markets. And Cuba was the place that kind of filled the vacuum that was left when the U.S. left the British Empire. So starting especially in the 1790s, the first decade of the 19th century, the Americans become much, much more focused on Cuba. And so for a while, what happened is the Americans kind of fit Cuba into their existing slave trading modus operandi. So American slave ships left New England. They would carry captives either from the Gold Coast or Upper Guinea to Cuba. But when the slave trade became illegal, what the Americans did, and that was in 1808, what the Americans did is they basically offshored their industry. Instead of sending ships out of North America, they moved operations to Cuba. And so they began to run their business from Cuba. After a few years, the Cubans, in essence, kind of learned the slave trade from the Americans and took it over. And they were connected. Cuban and Spanish slave traders had all kinds of connections with different parts of Africa, mostly through the Portuguese. So places like, you mentioned Nigeria, they would go to places, Lagos, Nigeria, and then Angola, and the area to the north of Angola near the Congo River estuary. These would eventually become very, very important destinations for slave ships. However, by this time, in the mid-19th century, a lot of these slave ships, the real sort of force behind them was Cuban, Spanish, sometimes Brazilian or Portuguese. And we can talk about it in a moment, but the Americans were more or less kind of relegated to supplying ships, to supplying captains, so that these ships could carry the American flag. But you're absolutely right that the shift to Cuba became kind of a permanent thing starting in 1808. And after that point, Cuba became, without a doubt, the focus of North American slave traders.
Now, let's continue with Brazil. I understand that as late as the 1840s, U.S. enslavers were playing a major role in bringing captives to Brazil, the state, the nation that ends up with the largest Black population west of Nigeria. And I also understand that a number of the captives not only emerged from Angola, but around the Cape into Southeast Africa, Mozambique in particular. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, that's absolutely right. So what happened, the Americans got involved in Brazil primarily because by this time, and we're talking about the mid-19th century, you mentioned the 1840s as kind of the critical moment for American slave traders in Brazil. What had happened is that the British had begun to crack down on the slave trade, and they forced Portugal and Brazil to agree to allow their ships to be searched by the Royal Navy if there was suspicions that these ships were engaged in the illegal slave trade. And what this did is it made the American flag much more attractive to these illegal slave traders, because the United States diplomatically steadfastly refused to allow the British Navy to search American ships. So these slave traders start to shift toward American vessels. And so during the 1840s, what you had is a kind of a pattern where American ship owners would send vessels down to Brazil, with regular ordinary cargoes. And then through a network of crooked merchants in Brazil, these ships would either be purchased or maybe just chartered by Brazilian merchants who would hire American captains, hire American crews, and they would use these ships. They'd send them across to, as you say, to Angola, also to the sort of major area where at that point the Brazilians are taking quite a lot of captives. That's in Southeast Africa, what's now Mozambique. And one of the interesting things that you see in this period is some of the American diplomats in Rio got very unhappy with this. They knew what was happening, and they started to keep track. And one of the things that you see in some of these records are American ships leaving Rio with all kinds of trade goods, and they're going to Angola and they're going to Mozambique, and then they're returning in ballast, meaning they're basically empty. And of course, what you can tell from those records is that obviously the Americans carried the trade goods to Angola, and then probably carried captives back to Brazil, but landed them somewhere outside of Rio, and then entered Rio in ballast, empty. And this went on for a good 10 years, and it would have continued, except for the fact that under extreme British military and diplomatic pressure, the Brazilians eventually abolished their slave trade after about 1850. But I think if that hadn't happened, the Americans would have stayed involved in that trade as they continue to be involved in the Cuba trade.
Having said that, and finally, Professor Kelley, what's next on your research agenda?
Well, all of this has kind of propelled me backwards in time. So actually, I'm working on the very earliest years of the slave trade, when the Portuguese, of course, were first going down the coast of Africa, and the first, truly slavery-based plantation colonies that they established in Cape Verde and in Sao Tome. So all of this work has kind of propelled me, I suppose, backwards in time, looking for origins and precedents and all that kind of thing. So I hope to produce something on that in a few years.
Well, that's fantastic, because I know for a fact that the records in Portugal are quite rich and oftentimes go untapped.
That's right. They are very rich. Yeah.
Yes. So having said that, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Sean M. Kelley, Professor of History at the University of Essex in the UK, author of the book American Slavers, Merchants, Mariners, and the Transatlantic Commerce and Captives, 1644 to 1865. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Special thanks to Professor Kelley for sharing his hard-earned knowledge with us. Where else can you get such quality content, context, and historical perspective other than Freedom Now? So call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show by donating today, and you'll get one of our awesome premiums to expand your library and your mind. Dr. Horne, tell the people about what else they can take home today.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear, and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by US imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 to receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now and make your support for the show and the station felt. Now we're going to keep this train moving and send you back off to Dr. Horne, who's being joined on the line by author Elena K. Abbott, right here on Freedom Now.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. And with me on the line is Elena K. Abbott, author of the book Beacons of Liberty, International Free Soil and the Fight for Racial Justice in Antebellum America. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Elena K. Abbott.
Thank you so much for having me, Gerald. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking with your listeners.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So why did you write this book, Beacons of Liberty?
Well, I have always been fascinated by the question of where freedom feels more free and why. My initial interest in this question actually stems all the way back to almost 15, maybe even 20 years ago, when I first read about the Creole Mutiny in 1841. And this is actually the story that opens Beacons of Liberty. In this story, 135 enslaved men and women aboard the domestic slave trade vessel, the Creole, rose up against their enslavers and took control of the ship. They were bound from Virginia to New Orleans, so along the coastal route of the domestic slave trade. But they knew, under the leadership of Madison Washington, one of the enslaved men aboard the ship, that if they sailed the boat for the Bahamas, which was British territory, they would be freed. So after they rose up and took control of the ship, they forced the crew to sail for the Bahamas. And once there, they were indeed freed. But a significant number of them actually immediately left from the Bahamas, right there from the harbor of Nassau, to Jamaica, another British island. So all the way back when I first read this story, I wondered why Jamaica would feel like the better choice for people who had just enacted their liberation in the Bahamas. What was going on there? What did they know about? Why did they choose one free place over another? What did they expect to find? So this mode of questioning continued to guide pretty much all of my research interests in various different ways throughout the past 15 years. I've always searched for stories of people who crossed borders to find freedom, or at least a place that felt more free to them over time, and in various different geographical contexts. And this eventually led me to focus this book, Beacons of Liberty, on the people traveling across international borders to escape the United States. So most famously, arguably, this includes the Underground Railroad to Canada. But as I traced down different pathways in the archives, I began focusing more and more on the sizable number of people crossing borders to Mexico, to the Caribbean, across the Atlantic Ocean, to England, to West Africa. So of course, I wanted to know why. Especially for free African American migrants, I wanted to know why they were choosing one place over another. And I wanted to know why Canada became such a major symbol of freedom, both in the anti-slavery movement and continuing through US cultural memory, when people were going to other places as well, and sometimes with much more intriguing rationales for those choices. So what was important to them? What were they hoping to find? What did they find? So in this book, Beacons of Liberty is really about how the expansion of freedom beyond the borders of the United States influenced the fight for freedom in the United States. It's about how free African Americans, fugitive or self-emancipated slaves, and white observers crossed international borders in search of Black freedom, equality, and opportunity. And it's ultimately about how their experiences abroad helped shape ideas about freedom, citizenship, and national character in the United States. So a little bit of background here is that beginning in the late 18th century and continuing through the 19th century, diverse anti-slavery efforts began reshaping the map of slavery and freedom in the Atlantic world. Anti-slave trade legislation and emancipation laws either immediately or gradually began freeing enslaved populations in places like Haiti, Canada, Mexico, some newly independent South American nations, Great Britain and the British West Indies, and Sierra Leone and Liberia. These places became what I call international free soil havens, and it's a phrase that I use to identify places with the potential, it's very different often from the practice, the potential to free and protect self-emancipated men and women and offer equal standing for free African American immigrants. So what the book shows is that the influence of these places on the fight for freedom and racial justice in the United States was profound, but incredibly complex. So looking at key inflection points between 1813 and 1863, the book tackles what I see as the three main effects that international free soil havens had on the fight for freedom in the 19th century. The first is that it provided physical alternatives to slavery and racism in the United States. In other words, places where free or fugitive people could go to escape slavery or to build new lives with greater access to things like education and economic opportunity. Second, these international free soil havens provided conceptual alternatives to slavery and racism in the United States. In other words, showing how freedom could be done. And finally, individual free soil havens became powerful symbols of freedom that stood in direct counterpoint to the ongoing existence of American slavery. So in a sense, this very, very old for me question of why were people going to places here rather than there? What were they finding? How did it affect their lives? This is what the whole book is shaped around. And in short, I would say that I was inspired by the stories I kept finding over 15 years about the ways and whys that people left the United States to search for freedom. Especially when it was happening in greater and greater numbers at the very same time that the fight for freedom in the United States was becoming a major flashpoint in American politics and social life. So that's the kind of overview of my book, but really does come back to the same kinds of questions that I've been searching for answers for a very long time.
Of course, to go back to the vignette that opens your book, Elena K. Abbott, the enslavers in the United States were infuriated when they lost their investments, when these enslaved Black Americans were able to sail into the Bahamas and be freed. And oftentimes those kinds of incidents brought Britain and the United States to the brink of war. And speaking of which, I recall that in 1833, 1834, when Britain itself was moving towards abolition, there was a kind of fire sale of enslaved Africans in Bermuda, the island off the coast of the Carolinas, that's British territory, selling those enslaved Africans into the Carolinas, which suggests that there are folk today who may have kinfolk in the Bermudas they do not know about. But speaking of which, could you expand upon the relationship between the United States and Bahamas, United States and enslaved Black people in the United States, beyond that notorious day of December 7th, 1841, a day, to coin a phrase, that enslavers thought would live forever in infamy, when you saw these Black people escape to freedom in the Bahamas?
Yes, wonderful, wonderful question. Just incredible history between the Bermudas and South Carolina. So the relationship between American slavery and British West Indian slavery was always very intimate, because of course, American slavery was once also British colonial slavery. So the relationship between the islands and the American coast, very close. And when the British started looking toward an end to slavery, that relationship became extremely fraught, even before either before slavery itself was abolished, or individual episodes like the Creole Mutiny became such firestorms, such touchstones in this moment. And this is because the British islands were seen as essentially places of experiment in the British anti-slavery process. Where the British islands went, so too would go American slavery, was kind of the idea here. So it was incredibly important for British slave owners to try to capitalize where they could through selling enslaved people, say, to South Carolina, rather than having them simply be freed by the British government. But also it was really important for former British enslavers after abolition to essentially show and prove that abolition was a disaster for the economy. It was a disaster for the island, for island life. And the investment there was deeply held by American enslavers as well. Americans were looking at the islands to see what the aftermath of slavery would be. And the pro-slavery messaging was that indeed abolition would cause both an economic and a social disaster. And so, of course, the United States should not free slaves. Meanwhile, anti-slavery advocates, anti-slavery observers, free African Americans were looking at the British islands as well and seeking to prove that neither the sugar economy nor the social life demonstrably suffered at all from the enslavement. In fact, it was improved. So the relationship between American slavery and slavery in the British Caribbean colonies was always intimate, either in partnership or within the experiment, quote unquote, to see how and whether slavery would unfold and whether this was a model that the United States should follow or avoid at all costs.
Now, we also know that during the bad old days of slavery, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of enslaved Africans, particularly in Texas, who escaped southward into Mexico. In fact, one of the reasons why Texas seceded from Mexico was precisely because Mexico was moving towards abolition of slavery under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero. Talk to us about that experience, fleeing to freedom in Mexico.
Yes. So I'm going to actually speak to the experience of fleeing to freedom in Mexico in two different ways, both of which are embedded in your question here. One is the experience of the self-emancipated or fugitive slaves who crossed to Mexico, and the other is the geopolitical crap storm that their movement across that border created in the United States. So crossing from Texas and just generally that entire southwestern region of enslavement into Mexico was enormously perilous, truly harrowing, between environmental factors from giant rivers to snakes, to the heat, the exposure. That was harrowing. So there was a lot of death and a lot of trauma associated with crossing into Mexico from Texas. And then also, once you've crossed into Mexico, though anti-slavery in principle, struggled with practice. Slave catchers from Texas could pretty much operate with impunity in Mexico. So slave catching was a peril that self-emancipated individuals continued to face throughout their time in Mexico. And also, there was a tendency from the Mexican government from basically the 1810s through the 1830s to have a fair amount of unclarity in their laws about what the legal standing of Black immigrants was. So compared to the experience of self-emancipated men and women and children in Canada, there was, by and large, less security in Mexico and less opportunity in some ways. So it was just a very difficult place to run to. Now, from a geopolitical standpoint, there were enough people running across the border to Mexico and finding freedom and disappearing into the Mexican hinterland that Texan slaveholders in particular, but American slaveholders more generally in solidarity, were incensed by the Mexican border and the fact that it seemed like a leaky faucet in the American slave system. So this created a number of very high-profile diplomatic crises and, as you point out, several moments of near war with Mexico because of this issue of fugitive slaves at the Mexican border. In fact, that contention at that border amplified the significance of every other international free soil border, from the sea border to the Caribbean, the land border to Mexico, the longer sea voyage to England or West Africa. All of these places actually had significantly fewer fugitive slaves crossing the borders than Canada, and yet collectively, and in particular because of the Mexico situation, the political fervor of the pro-slavery side, the pro-slavery camp, just amplified everything to this point of essentially permanent crisis for the pro-slavery lobby. And that created an incredibly ripe place for anti-slavery advocates to to push on, to spread awareness about the numbers and experiences of Black Americans finding freedom across these borders, and really just sticking it to the slave system. So it really was just a building, I call it a snowball effect, of the pro-slavery advocates seeing crisis at the Texas-Mexico border, amplified by all of these other international border crossings. The result really did lead to first the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and then it was in many ways just a slippery slide into civil war. So all of this kind of snowballing really starts in some ways at the Texas-Mexico border.
Finally, Elena K. Abbott, author of the book Beacons of Liberty, talk to us about Black Americans, enslaved Africans in North America, fleeing back to the ancestral homeland, that is to say, Africa.
Yes, thank you. This is always one of the most rich, fascinating, and complex spaces, to my mind, of this whole story. So prior to the Civil War and abolition, Sierra Leone and subsequently Liberia were places established by the British and the American Colonization Society, respectively, in the late 1810s, early 1820s. These were places that were used in very different ways by the British and by the American Colonization Society. Sierra Leone was an anti-slave trade colony. It was a place where the British anti-slave trade squadron, which was active on the Atlantic and also the Indian Ocean, but Sierra Leone was relevant for the Atlantic. This is where slave trading vessels that the anti-slave trade squadron would take on the high seas, they would take them to Sierra Leone, and the enslaved Africans aboard would be freed in Sierra Leone. The American Colonization Society, which founded Liberia, was a very different model. Liberia from the start was a colony designed for the relocation of freed African Americans from the United States to Africa. The idea being a return to homeland. Now, of course, enslaved people in the United States, by and large, were neither themselves from the region of Liberia, nor were their ancestors. And as we know, there's enormous complexity in how to make those genealogical and homeland connections. Moreover, the American Colonization Society was not a by choice relocation. It was a white-led organization that was premised on the idea that free Black people had no home in the United States and they needed to be exported elsewhere. So needless to say, the relationship between free African Americans and freed African Americans, formerly enslaved, and the American Colonization Society was incredibly fraught throughout the 19th century. And by fraught, I mean antagonistic, extremely antagonistic. But there were very significant moments throughout the 19th century where the idea of return to Liberia, or the idea of return to Africa via Liberia, did start to hold more water for some prominent individuals. And they kind of set the stage for the idea of a Black colony once Liberia was, once it became independent of the American Colonization Society. It took on new meaning for a lot of freed Black Americans who were seeing an increasingly hostile legal and racial regime in the United States and looking for alternatives. So deeper into the 19th century, there was an increasing interest among free and freed African Americans in the idea of Liberia as a Black colony, where freedom freedom, equality, and opportunity were available. But where Liberia in particular became more significant is actually after the Reconstruction era, after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. When Reconstruction came to a premature end in the late 1870s due to paramilitary violence and just an extreme effort to resuscitate all the pillars of white supremacy in the United States, Southern Black Americans in particular started in more numbers than ever before to partner with the American Colonization Society, actually, to move to Liberia. And then, of course, Liberia also has continued to have resonance and relevance deeper into the 20th century with Marcus Garvey. So the relationship between West Africa in particular and the end of American slavery, and prior to the end of American slavery, the movement of free and formerly enslaved individuals across the Atlantic back to a homeland has just been a very, very complex and ongoing, I think, conversation. And Liberia just plays a very interesting role there that I'm always interested in learning more about. There's continuing to be incredibly interesting and rich scholarship on the legacy into the late 19th and early 20th centuries about that fraught relationship in the 19th century with the ACS. So it's a phenomenally rich and complex conversation there.
Rich and complex indeed, as we can also say about your book, Elena K. Abbott, author of Beacons of Liberty, International Free Soil, and the Fight for Racial Justice in Antebellum America. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much, Gerald. I appreciate being here.
And we appreciate having you.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guest, Professor Sean M. Kelley from the University of Essex in the United Kingdom, as well as author Elena K. Abbott, for joining us on the show today. Find that Black-owned bookstore you know and love and get their books right now. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and get one of Dr. Gerald Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder Baba Didan Kamathi. Shout out to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of you loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. Please continue to support our programming. We are volunteer producers, and the station needs your help to keep the lights on in the building and the mics hot for us to bring you this quality content. So please dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.